This is the GardenDC Podcast, the podcast about everything gardening in the Washington, D.C. and Mid-Atlantic region. I'm your host, Kathy Jentz. I'm the editor of Washington Gardener magazine, and we're aimed at gardening enthusiasts, people who grow everything from edibles to ornamentals, natives to exotics. If it grows in our area, that's what we talk about.
Welcome to episode 200 of the GardenDC Podcast. In this very special episode, I'm interviewed by intern Josh Panepento about the podcast's first 200 episodes and some of the behind-the-scenes production secrets. The plant profile is on Egyptian starflower, and we share what's going on in the garden as well as some upcoming local gardening events and this week's garden tasks in the What's New segment. We close out with the last word on types of beans from Christy Page of Green Prints. This is Kathy Jentz, host of the GardenDC Podcast, and I'm joined by one of our summer interns, Josh Panepento. Welcome, Josh.
Hi, Kathy. Thank you for having me on.
So Josh is going to be interviewing me, a little bit of turning the tables on myself, because this is episode 200. And way back at episode 100, we did a behind the scenes about how the podcast started and all that good stuff. So in this episode, we thought we'd look back at the last 200 episodes, how the podcast has grown since the beginning, share some of those behind the scenes production secrets, and that sort of thing.
Yeah, right on. If we're ready, I can jump right into the first question.
Sure, Josh.
All right. So, in the past 100 episodes, how have you grown as a podcaster just overall?
So that would be from episode 101 to 200, which I was scanning through in the last couple of days to bring back some memories. And I would say I've relaxed a little bit. How's that? So I had attended, I think it was She Podcasts is the name of one of the podcast academies. And I go to a lot of podcast webinars and talks and those sorts of things to improve. And one of their top pieces of advice was I never was a yeller into the microphone. That's always been a pet peeve of mine. You have a microphone, you don't need to yell. but there's Fancy. Did you hear her in the background?
Yeah, a little bit.
She's chiming in about her experience in the last 100 episodes. Anyway, so one of their top pieces of advice was to take it down a notch on the volume and the energy, and not to be too high energy, but to be a little bit more relaxed, because you're right in listeners' ears. And it's better to be soothing than to be strident. So I've tried to do that a little bit. And I think the other way we've grown is just getting guests that many people might be familiar with, a few outside the Mid-Atlantic area, some big names out there. So I'm always looking to find that next great guest.
Yeah, well, that's the perfect transition into my next question about guests specifically. Which recent ones have stood out to you?
Well, we had Doug Tallamy on, and he's one of the rock stars in the horticultural world currently. And way back in one of our first episodes, we talked about his book and all about him with a local gardener, because I didn't even think to ask Doug himself. I think I was intimidated, or it didn't even cross my mind. So I'm past all that. I'm like, Doug, come on the podcast. And he readily said yes. So I was happy about that. We've had Margaret Roach, who's the New York Times garden columnist. She was formerly with Martha Stewart Living as their editor. So she was a great get for us. Ken Druse, who's a friend of Margaret and an NPR radio host as well. And Ken did a fabulous job, as I knew he would. But yeah, we've had some great people on the podcast.
Yeah, that's great. And to kind of take it into the behind the scenes area of it, how do you choose who to invite as a guest? And have you ever had kind of trouble landing a guest?
Yeah, I've had a few people who, are very trepidatious about the whole recording thing. They don't like the sound of their voice. They've never done a podcast before. So I've had a few of those that I just had to coach through and get that way, because they're either expert in their field, but they're not used to being recorded or interviewed at all. And then there's those that are just too busy. So that's the ones that are the really hard ones to get a hold of. Just to pin down a time and a topic with them sometimes can be a struggle. And then there's those who they've heard the podcast, they're a fan of the podcast, but when I ask them to be on, they demur and they say, no, my story's not interesting. And I'm like, yes, it is. So I still have a couple of those. I'm trying to twist their arm and bring on the podcast, but they're probably listening to this episode and you know who you are.
Yeah, it could definitely be intimidating since this is my first time being on a podcast, but you settle into it. It feels pretty good.
Yeah, I always say it's just a casual conversation between us. And the great thing is, it's not live radio. So we do have a fallback of editing if we have to.
Yeah, very true. Like you said earlier, just relax,
hmm
Have you been able to catch up with any past guests recently?
Yeah, so I just visited Sue Hunter, who was, I think it was episode 178 on hollies, and she's the president of the American Holly Society. And we went to visit her Serviceberry Festival a weekend or so ago and got to see the holly collection, her holly arboretum, as well as the Serviceberry orchard and the rest of her place. And Josh, the highlight for me was her cats. So I was like, everything else is great. She has a native plant nursery. She has retail, which I didn't even know she had retail. I thought she was just wholesale. So everybody who's in the Felton, Pennsylvania area, which is just past the Maryland, Pennsylvania border, go up and visit. It's Heartwood Nursery. But she has a collection of cats, and we had written a short blog post about the cats. Sue had submitted with some photos of these greenhouse and farm cats for my Cats and Gardens blog that I do as a fun side hobby. I had forgotten all about that post. So I showed up at Heartwood Nursery, and a couple kitties came running out to greet me, and I was like, oh, I am in my heaven. Plants and cats. So that was perfect. But yeah, so it was great to catch up with her. And I know, Josh, we assigned you to do a profile of Sue
Yep.
for an upcoming issue of Washington Gardener magazine. So listeners and readers, look out for that, because Sue is a fascinating woman, and she's like one of those that wears many hats, does many things. And I think it's going to be a great profile.
Yeah, I can't wait to sit down and pick her brain a little bit. The cats thing is hilarious, though, because I think my favorite surprise guest has been Fancy every once
Yeah.
in a while.
It's funny because for listeners, I do have 3 cats, but you're probably only ever going to hear Fancy because for some reason she thinks when I'm talking into the headset, I'm talking to her. Number 1. And number 2, the 2 boy cats sleep most of the day, as classic lion hunter types, male lions do. And then the female is out running around all day chasing her toys and wanting to play and interact. As the typical female lioness is, the active hunter. So she is definitely the more vocal of the 3. And I was going to say, back to your question about other guests that I've caught up with.
Yep.
So there's a few like Janet Draper, who I visited the Ripley Garden not too long ago and took some pictures of her in the garden and of the garden itself. It's always great to visit the Ripley Garden, which, if listeners don't know, that's part of the Smithsonian Gardens collection between the Arts and Industry and the Hirshhorn Building. And that's one of my favorite public gardens anywhere. Another guest I caught up with recently was at the Mount Cuba Trials Day, and that's outside of Wilmington, Delaware. There were several GardenDC podcast guests there because it was a who's who of the horticultural world basically showed up for that trial evening. They usually hold that at the end of summer because most of the native plant trials, you want to show it at the end of the summer when they're in full bloom, prairie type plants. But in this case, they wanted to show some of the more spring blooming ones. So I ran into Andrew Bunting, who's talked about magnolias and other plants and the gold medal plants program for Pennsylvania Hort Society. I ran into Sam Hoadley, of course, and other Mount Cuba staff members who've been on the podcast. And I was just thinking of a third person I ran into. It just escaped me, Josh, but it'll come back to me.
Yeah, all good. So keeping with the guest theme, and we already talked about some kind of higher profile guests you've had on, but are there any dream guests that you hope to interview maybe in the next 100 episodes?
Yeah, I think Martha Stewart herself, I
Oh,
would
yeah.
love to have on, and she's doing a garden program. I think it's for the Roku channel. It's a free half-hour garden program, and I've been catching up on those episodes. And I know she's also now Miracle Grow's spokesperson along with her head gardener. So her head gardener and I've been exchanging Instagram direct messages and also asked him if he would be on. I have not gotten a reply from either. So if you're listening to this, we would love to have you on the podcast. And I was trying to think about anybody else out there in the world that I haven't gotten on that I'd like to get on. Maybe some of the English gardeners like Fergus Garrett, even though they are way outside of our mid-Atlantic topic area. Some of the English gardeners I was thinking about doing, we did a couple comparison podcast episodes where we did ground covers versus ground covers, where that was the author of a book out of the Pacific Northwest, but on the Canadian side of the border. And then we did a Washington versus Washington episode where we compared the state of Washington with Washington, D.C., geology, weather, and gardening, because we're very similar planting zones with some garden podcasters stationed in Washington State. So I've been like mulling whether I should do some comparison podcast episodes with, say, somebody all the way on the other side of the world, like Australia or South Africa might be interesting, or someone in Asia, and then also maybe northern versus southern hemisphere. So if anybody knows any great South American garden podcasters, I'd love to talk to them. And also maybe doing again that comparison show with some British gardeners, so we can do a British versus American garden off, which, I'm going to put up a valiant battle, but I know I'm going to lose the war, Josh, on that one. So.
Yeah, a comparison episode would be very cool, but those are some great answers. I think Martha Stewart would be such an amazing guest and just a really fun listen.
Yeah, she is such a garden aficionado, and I know she comes down to our area to go to White's Nursery outside of Germantown, Maryland, to get her azaleas every year, or sends her gardeners down. I know she's made the trip herself, so that tells me she's a pretty diehard gardener.
Oh, for sure, yeah.
I remembered who the other one that I ran into at Mount Cuba is. That's Ethan Kaufman of Stoneleigh, A Natural Garden. And it was great to bump into him and hear some of the reactions that he had been getting to that podcast episode that he was on, because he said they got a great number of new visitors who discovered them through the podcast, which was fabulous to hear. That was episode 180, Stoneleigh, A Natural Garden. And then he said he had a lot of returning or regular visitors who said they learned new things in that episode.
Had a feeling we'd come back to that at some point. So with a lot of milestone episode podcasts, I see that they will do kind of a blooper reel type of thing. Would there be enough bloopers from this podcast to do that sort of thing?
Josh, I wish. But it's probably a good thing that we don't have that many. All we usually have is somebody coughing or sneezing, or an ambulance goes by in the background. So nothing, earth-shattering, nothing that I've cut and kept to the side. I've thought about it a few times. I've said, is this worth anything? But it's not we both dissolve into laughter, bad take, outtakes. Fortunately and unfortunately, I'd love to be able to share some of those, but nope, no big bloopers, just usually a long pause at the most, or there's been the occasion where somebody's internet has gone out or their microphone has gone out, and you'll just hear them say, Kathy, and those are not exciting bloopers to be sharing, unfortunately.
Yeah, that'd be a pretty boring blooper reel if it was just silence.
Silence, and then the occasional pen hitting the desk sound
Yeah.
that we cut out, or something like that.
All right, so shifting away from the guests, just from a broad standpoint about Washington Gardener, how do you hope to grow Washington Gardener's social media presence?
I guess no pun intended. So I think we want to do a little more concentration on our TikTok channel. So I'm heavily present on Twitter and Instagram and Facebook, a little bit on Blue Sky, Threads, those Twitter alternatives or X alternatives that have sprung up. But I've kind of been ignoring TikTok, and I feel like we should be a little bit more on there just for reaching out to some of the younger gardeners for inspiration, letting people know the podcast exists. So one of the projects I have Josh and the other summer intern scheduled to do, and that's Isha Bhatti is the other summer intern this summer, is to take excerpts from this podcast and put a little bit of video to them and share those on TikTok on hoping, that some of those will come on over and be regular listeners.
Yeah, I think TikTok is a really great way to get the younger audience, even though it was just in a weird spot with the Senate hearing, but hopefully it sticks around.
And I think even if TikTok goes away, there'll be somebody else that springs up.
Yeah.
And YouTube Shorts, I usually cross post the TikTok videos over to YouTube Shorts as well. So they can do double duty as that, or Instagram Reel too. So they won't be totally lost should TikTok go down overnight for some strange reason.
Yeah, for sure. Shifting to the last milestone episode, that was only 2 years ago, but you said that in the next 5 years, you hope to host more garden events or seed exchanges, flower shows, things like that. You also said you wanted to publish more books. How much of this have you accomplished, and how much are you actively trying to get done?
Yeah, so that 100th episode was April 16th, 2022, just looking that up. And so my book, Groundcover Revolution, came out last spring of 2023. So that came to fruition. I'm not sure on a third book. I have a couple ideas I'm noodling around. Books are a lot of work, but it's more the time. It really is a time crunch. So if I could lock myself away in a room for 2 solid weeks, maybe I could crank out the majority of a book that's been in the back of my brain for a while. And that relates to animals and gardening. So what we touched on earlier with the Cats and Gardens blog. So it'd probably be about that topic. And as far as hosting events, we continue on with the seed exchange. I introduced Reduce Your Lawn Day this year, partnering with American Meadows. So that's every May 20th. And that sprung up from the Groundcover Revolution book, an idea I had from that. So that has really taken off, and I'm so grateful. I knew it would be popular. I didn't know how popular, Josh. I didn't know that I would be getting press calls almost every day this spring. So that was pulling a lot of my time away that I thought I'd be able to devote to other projects. So I've been interviewed on other podcasts for newspaper, magazine, and other articles mentioning Reduce Your Lawn Day. And I think it's something like many holidays that will start off small and kind of build each year, because the first Arbor Day I know was a tiny thing, first Earth Day was a small thing, and then every year it gets built on. And that's what I hope for Reduce Your Lawn Day, that civic groups and municipalities, governments take it on as part of their programming. So like their Parks and Recs department might have an annual Reduce Your Lawn Day festival or something each year, or planting.
Yeah, that would be fantastic to see that grow, no pun intended again. But so with another 5 years, even though this first 5 years that we mentioned is not done yet, you still have time. Do you hope to get just any more projects done in the next 5?
Yeah, I'm thinking of some more live things, going back to what you had asked about social media too, of regularly scheduling maybe say every Monday or every other Monday, a check-in from the garden. That could be a YouTube live or Instagram live, just some regular session where listeners and readers could join me and ask their garden questions, and it's, free and open to all. And I give kind of update of what's going on in the garden and show them that. So that's been on my to-do list for quite some time. So I just really need to schedule that in. And I think other than that, I just expanding my speaking, doing some national level talks. I'd love to increase those national level talks. I don't like traveling. In particular, I like being at the destination, Josh, but I hate the journey to get there. I don't love flying. I've never liked flying, but I'll do it. And then being away from the garden and the kitties and all my other things, it's always say something like every day you're away is 2 days of makeup coming back. Like the tasks that are left undone just pile up. So that's the other reason why I don't love traveling. But of course, Zoom makes it a lot easier to talk to some of those groups. So I just spoke to the Seed Savers Exchange, their kind of international seed meeting that they have virtually. And that was a great experience, being able to do that over Zoom, because getting out to Idaho, I think is where they're based, would have not probably been possible in the last couple of weeks.
Yeah, I think those are some really cool ideas, especially the going live on Tuesday was a lot of fun. Harvesting the garlic. Would you hope to kind of just in the very near future, next month or so, just keep going live of like in the garden, harvesting, stuff like that.
Yeah, I think that's fun to do. So for listeners and readers on our Instagram channel at WDC Gardener, we just jumped on a Instagram live while I was digging out our garlic this week, which is a much smaller harvest than usual because I didn't plant as much last fall as I usually do. But also the heads themselves were a little bit on the smaller side. And I contribute that to this last spring few weeks of drought and then the last few weeks of drought when they would have been putting on more of their growth, and I wasn't watering garlic. I was watering everything else to keep it alive. But the last thing I was thinking was garlic. But yeah, it's always great to have a reveal video like that, Josh, like when we're digging up the sweet potatoes or dumping out maybe the potato bag that I've been growing to see how many potatoes we end up with, or zero, which is what happened last, I want to say September. Josh, we were going to go on live and reveal our sweet potatoes. I started digging and there was just vines, and the sweet potatoes in the ground had been eaten to the nub.
Oh no.
So that was quite a reveal, but it's the truth and it's fun to share.
Yeah, that's terrible that it was vines, but at least you're open and honest.
Mhm.
You're not trying to be perfect online. That's good.
To say it was a little bit of a shock that the vines were still growing and healthy, but really had no tubers. So,
So sticking with the garden right now, is there anything right now that you're particularly just excited about growing that's
well, a friend of mine has offered me some pink okra seedlings. So I'm waiting for her to drop those off because I'm a big fan of okra and I've grown several varieties, but not this pink one. And I think she sourced that from Rare Seeds. So looking forward to that. Also, I have several different kinds of cotton. So a red cotton and different strains of cotton. And I had grown just the straight, regular white cotton one year, and that did really well for us. So it's not an edible plant, decorative
yeah.
and useful, obviously, as a textile and fiber, but it's a beautiful flower. It has a long history in our region, especially obviously in Virginia and the plantation system that they had there. So it thrives in our environment, but not that many people are growing it in their home garden. And I think it will be a fun thing for people to grow, to teach history and to engage children with, and just to see how cotton grows, because a lot of people aren't even familiar with the cotton plant itself.
Yeah, that's really interesting. With the community garden right now, Isha and I are planting tomatoes, peppers, and an eggplant.
Hmm.
How would you rate how we're doing so far? I know we're only a few weeks in.
Yeah, it's only a few weeks in. I think they're doing well. We have to keep on top of those weeds, but we're keeping those down. And right now, it's unusual because it's been so dry and hot
Yeah,
and not much rain. So, pretty much, I'm out there watering every day. And when you guys come, we have you water and weed them around them. But I think the plants are not going to complain too much about the heat. So they're going to be putting on a lot of growth in the next few weeks, and then we'll see what comes out of it. But there's already a pepper forming and a couple of, I think it's the white currant.
yep,
We saw some of those forming. So those will probably be the first. It's always usually the cherry tomatoes or the tiny out of hand ones that you would just snack on straight from the plant rather than like, I think one of the ones we're growing might be the orange icicle.
that sounds right. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's like Roma tomato meant for making sauce, but it's orange, like a little bit milder, I think, less acidic one. So I'm interested in trying that one.
I mean, as long as the plants are not dead yet, I think we're doing a great job.
Yeah, and we did our first application of fish fertilizer. What did you think about that, Josh?
It was great that it was organic, but that smell was just hard to get over. It was consistency was also surprising.
Mm-hmm.
It was like a goop, like a weird brown goop.
Yep. So it's more like sludge.
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah.
We add a capful to our gallon or so of water and stir it up, and so it dissipates a bit. And I didn't smell anything today when I went over to the plot, so
That's good.
that's always a good thing because the fishy smell is not the greatest to garden around.
Yeah, definitely not the best smell, but if it's gonna help, you gotta do what you gotta do.
Hmm.
So back to the podcast. What can listeners expect? Can we get a little glimpse into the next 100 episodes?
That's a good question. So I tend to not plan so far ahead and be more open to guests that might be appearing out of the blue, because some people are working on a book and they're keeping that under wraps. And then I'll hear from their publicist or their publisher or them themselves that the book is about to come out. So I'll get a review copy and then I'll look it over and see if that's appropriate for the podcast. So there's always surprises that way. I'd like to have more interaction with listeners. So I'm trying to figure out a way to do a live podcast recording at one of our events, and how to do that technically, and also how to do that and make it part of the event. Say, if it was at our tomato taste at market in August, that might be a little chaotic because there's the whole crowd at the farmer's market, there's everybody else, the background noise. So that might be a little tough, but maybe at something like our seed exchange at Brookside Gardens, we could either stay an hour after or maybe stay or do it the hour before, although that's usually our super busy time of setting up, and having audience members who wanted to stay and even listeners who wanted to just come in for it be able to ask live questions, of course, live to tape. And we would be editing, Josh, because I don't think I want to do straight out live.
Yeah, that would be really tough. But it's good that you're hoping to get the audience involved.
Yeah, and I'm encouraging, we have a lot of interactive features with the Spotify app. And of course, people can post reviews at Good Pods and Apple and wherever they're listening to the episode. And of course, on our blog and website under the episode where it's posted, and on YouTube, they can always post comments and questions there. But this would be more live and be able to ask gardening questions specifically, or questions of the expert that we might have as a guest.
Yeah, that's very interesting. So with those Spotify polls, have you gotten any interesting responses to those yet?
Yeah, so participation is just usually a handful of responses to each episode. So if you're listening to it on the Spotify app, you might see a pop up that says there's a poll question. So you can click on that, and it's usually multiple choice. I think they give me up to seven, maybe, it might be six options. Sometimes I'll say an all of the above, sometimes I'll say multiple answers are allowed, like they can click on several. So if, say, we had an episode on summer vegetables, I might ask, what summer vegetables are you growing this year? And it would be like tomato, corn, peppers, etc. So they could click on several. But there's just a bit of a handful of responses. But Josh, the funniest thing to me is when I ask an episode, say clematis, and I say, are you growing clematis? And if so, what kinds, or blah, blah, blah. I always put a no, not growing it option, and the amount of people who click off on that but listen to the episode and enjoyed it is so funny to me. So same thing with any other topic, I'll say, they're like, nope, don't do that, but still listen to the episode. And I guess they're just maybe listening because they listen to all the episodes. Thank you, listeners who are doing so. Or they're listening to try to learn about it and decide if they want to do it. But yeah, that's always funny to me, that the ones that haven't participated in the activity or growing of that plant who participate in the poll itself.
Yeah, I think that's such a great thing because even like myself, I wouldn't call myself anywhere near an expert gardener, but I still do enjoy listening to these episodes, like the episode with Josh Singer about keeping pests out of your garden. I learned so much from that, just about, everything from deterring pests, but also how to do it naturally and all that.
Yeah, I think I keep trying to tell people who aren't current listeners that you don't have to be a gardener, that a lot of it is personality driven, especially with some of the authors. You might be curious about them, like our Murder in the Garden one, which is Garden Mysteries. And if you're a mystery fan, you're going to love that episode, whether you care about gardening or not. And then we have a lot about wildlife, from birdscaping to the episode you mentioned with garden pest control. So that's going to apply to everybody. There's going to be something of interest to everybody.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, even if you're not 100% interested, there's a lot to learn. Keeping with the listeners, are there ways right now that you have, other than the Spotify polls, gotten them involved? I've seen you kind of post some reviews on the Twitter.
Yeah, so when I post the episode is up, and then I'll put it across social media, usually on a Saturday afternoon after it comes out. If people comment on it or come back and put a comment under the social media posts, I'll usually grab those and their little avatar and share that as a little graphic as a review. And if I see somebody do a review on Good Pods, that's a great site to post your reviews, or Apple review pop up that I want to quote, I'll use those. And so those are great for feedback. But Josh, I don't get that many of those. I get a lot of verbal in person.
Oh,
So it's mostly going to events, or I'm speaking somewhere, or I'm at an open garden, and people will come up to me there and give me direct feedback. Thankfully, mostly all positive.
mostly. Wow.
Yeah. But that I never get in writing. Some of those comments I would love to have in writing. So, listeners, we would love to have it in writing and be able to share those. But it's always gratifying to get that in person feedback too.
Yeah. I mean, you say it's mostly positive. Have you had some weird encounters at all with the listeners?
Yeah, I would say there's one controversial episode we had not too long ago, Native Plant Fallacies, what I believe was the title. I'm trying to find the episode number for that one. It is our number one as far as listener numbers, but it is definitely our most controversial. I'm going to look up that episode number for you guys. 173. So it's called Native Plant Fallacies, where I interviewed Carol Reese. She's an extension horticultural specialist in Tennessee, and she has developed several theories about native plants versus exotics. And so that really brought out some high feelings, I'll just call it, with people. So got some nasty reviews for just even having Carol on and talking to her, but also some other people who were super grateful to have another viewpoint that wasn't 100% pro native plant all the time everywhere. So I think a lot of people were expressing relief at some of Carol's sharing and theories. So it was very interesting to hear some of the reactions to that one.
Yeah, that does sound interesting.
I think it was on the Facebook page under the episode, there was, I would say the comments were a little on fire.
Oh,
It kind of, started to be a little too negative against the poster, who was saying, I didn't love the episode. Why did you have Carol on? But then there was personal attacks, which, that's where I draw the line. So
yeah.
I'm going to either hide or delete those comments. But I am definitely open to robust debates and all viewpoints and having them on the podcast and, of course, on the comments too. Love to hear everybody's opinion on those.
Yeah, it can be sad when it becomes personal, but it's good that you're regulating that.
Yeah, I just don't see gardeners in general, Josh, are super friendly, super generous. I was thinking at one point of doing an episode about gardening and not being neurotypical. How's that for phrasing it? maybe a better title will come along, but that a lot of gardeners aren't people. They're plant people or animal people. They love both, and they probably are introverts or have introvert tendencies, or they might be on the autism spectrum or somehow neural atypical. So that comes into play, I think, also in a lot of this, is that there's some socializing that we do. We love our plants, and we can write and talk about them online a lot, but in person, people get shy. So they wouldn't be expressing all of that. And that could also translate into maybe not so much of the reactions that I'm looking for people to send audio questions in and that sort of thing, because again, they're shy about sharing that way, but they're not shy at all about replying or commenting on social media, of course, because you kind of have that buffer in between you.
Yeah, that makes sense. With these encounters with these listeners, mostly the positive ones, can you just talk a bit about kind of what that means to you?
Yeah, it's really gratifying. I mean, you put out a podcast and you don't know if it's just going to be one person, a family member listening to it or not. But we have very good numbers. We're in the top 5% of podcasts worldwide. And that's not to brag, just to say that the majority of podcasts out there don't make it past their 5th or 10th episode. So 200 is a huge deal, just that. So most either are short term by planning. It was like a serial podcast that was 5 parts, or they just gave up, ran out of steam, or didn't get the right reaction, or just lost passion for it. And then from the ones that are still active, a lot of them are either political or sports or, again, murder mysteries, or what is it called when it's like real life true crime.
Oh, yeah.
So those dominate the podcasting world. So gardening podcasts are a tiny, tiny little tiny fraction of 1% niche of the podcast world. So it's great to have good and steady numbers from our listeners and to be able to see that, and that we do have listeners worldwide, even though the podcast is centered around the mid-Atlantic US. I do try to appeal to everybody everywhere. I think some people, maybe they're just trying to learn English better. Or they're gardening fanatics and they want to listen to every gardening podcast, and we love them to be part of that. But I would say when I'm out at, say, an open garden, I might have somebody come up behind me and say, "Oh, I heard your voice and I knew it was you." So they'll come up and they'll say how much they love the podcast, and they'll comment on a recent episode that they really enjoyed and why they enjoyed that. So that's great feedback to have.
Yeah, and top 5%, that's no easy feat. So you mentioned right there the passion. Like you said, some podcasts don't make it too far because people lose the passion. Would you say that your passion for this has stayed the same throughout all 200?
I wouldn't say it stayed the same. I actually think that it has increased. So I would say in the beginning, I was kind of trepidatious about it. It was during COVID. Would I stick with it, or would I be one of those that, after 10 episodes, getting too busy, I'm going to turn to something else, especially if I didn't get good feedback on it? I probably would have done the same. I probably would have given up and maybe restarted with another podcast later on. But having great reaction right away helps, running into listeners helps in getting their feedback, and then the guests themselves, there's always so much to learn from them that I feel like even if I had 0 listeners, Josh, just between you and me, I get to pick these people's brains and ask my gardening questions, on behalf of the listeners. A lot of time I'm asking a question that I might already know the answer to.
Yeah.
But sometimes, like say with the epimediums episode, I love epimedium so much that I could have talked to her for days and not have recorded it and not shared it ever, and I would have been super happy.
That's great. So you're kind of in it for, not in a selfish way, but you're in it a little bit for yourself because you just enjoy these conversations.
Yeah, and I think hopefully it shows, Josh, because there are those podcasts that I've listened to where the host just sounds disinterested or is reading a list of questions and not engaging with the expert or the interviewee at all.
Yeah.
And I hope it comes across that almost all of the guests we've had on the podcast have either been people I've known outside of the podcast previously, either personal friends or horticulturists that I've worked with in other capacities. And if it was my first time meeting them through the podcast, then I'm just super curious about the person as well.
Yeah, that makes sense. Do you find it easier to talk to someone who you already know?
Definitely, because then I know also their push points.
Oh, true.
Especially if I know them very well, I can get into their buttons and push a little bit that way because I know what hot topics they want to talk about and what they're passionate about. So that definitely makes it easier. I just have to keep in mind in jokes and that sort of thing. It have to either be explained or shared with listeners or edited out because not everybody is going to get that.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah. Because I was thinking maybe talking to someone new, it would, even though it can be hard to talk to new people, like there would be more maybe to talk about that you don't know about them, something like that.
Yeah, I get to discover more about them, but then I also don't know what their answers might be. I know what they're probably is posted on LinkedIn and their bio, and I kind of can predict their answers, but they might surprise you. And I think it was a journalism teacher I had a long time ago that said, never ask a question you don't know the answer to already. I don't believe in that 100%.
Yeah.
But there is some validity to it because if you go into an interview and don't know and haven't researched, they can come back with some really surprising responses that can throw you off. So you're like, oh, that's not the direction I thought this conversation was going. So good to at least be prepared all around. Even if I know the person very well, I'm still going to do some research before the episode.
Yeah, definitely. That's important. How much research would you say that you do, or how much time do you spend on it?
Usually for an hour, long interview, which is most of them, and we'll cut them down a little bit, maybe to 45 minutes or so, then I'm doing at least an hour of research. That's if I know them well and I know the topic well, then I could just refresh myself on some things. But if it's somebody who's written a new book and I don't know them, then I'm going to read the book. I'm going to research a bit about them and the topic, and that could be hours and hours, depending on how long the book is. I might actually go and try to find YouTube interviews with the person. That's the most helpful to me, actually, is finding a past podcast or radio show online or YouTube interview they've been on, or if they've given a talk and is put up on YouTube, so they could hear their voice and little bit about them and get to know them that way, because it's really tough when you are kind of going in blind and you just don't know the person at all, or what their voice is like, how their vocal patterns are, and really how they're going to be on the podcast.
Would you say that you enjoy doing this research, since it's obviously a topic that you're very, very passionate about?
Yeah, I would enjoy the research a lot of the times. The books are usually sent to me because they're good books. They're not usually going to send me something that they think is a clunker
Yeah,
and
yeah.
propose the author to be on the podcast. So those are, I would probably have already read them, even if they weren't going to be on the podcast. Eventually, I was going to read it anyway, so it makes it part of it as well.
Yeah, that's very great. So are there any recent gardening events that you've been to that you really enjoyed? Maybe you talked to some people that you enjoyed talking to?
Yeah, I think at Green Spring Gardens, I wasn't able to set up our booth that day at the big spring plant sale because it rained cats and dogs that day. They still held the event, so I went to help out at the Rock Garden Society's booth. I would say I wasn't that much help. I was spending my time talking and shopping and running around, but I did get to run into a bunch of listeners at that, so that was gratifying, and spread the word about the podcast. We attended in the springtime RootingDC, and we had stickers made for the podcast with our logo on it and handed that out to a bunch of people
that's
and told
great.
them about the podcast. So that was fun to do. I do have a surprise, Josh, for our 200th, and I am ordering embroidery patches of the podcast logo, and I'm going to have those available to listeners, and I'm not sure how I'm going to do the availability yet, if I'm going to do it as prizes or just give it away at events or have it by people writing in. So stay tuned for that.
Yeah, that's really cool. What made you think of that?
Well, I was about to reorder the stickers because we ran out of the stickers at those events. And I said, okay, should I reorder these stickers? And then I was working on my embroidery jacket. So I have an old vintage Boy Scout jacket that came to me. I got it through a church sale, and it has several patches on it from other places, and like Cape Canaveral in Florida, Smithsonian Institution. So almost all the places on the jacket I've already been. And then when I go to a new place like Seattle or Salt Lake City, I'll look for a patch to add on. Kind of running out of space, but still can find some places on it. So I was like, I'm always asking for embroidery patches. And then I said, let me just look online. How much is an embroidery patch to make? And I thought it would be like $5 a patch, but no, it's much less expensive. So I think that's good. So I'm just getting a couple samples now to see how the logo looks and if it will work as an embroidery patch. So really, it was selfish, Josh. I just want an embroidery patch of the podcast to put on a shirt or jacket for myself. But yeah, I think that would be a great item to share, because one thing we were thinking about with the spring interns was doing gloves. So like a glove with our little are you born with a green thumb question on it. But when I started to look at gloves that are available with printing, they're pretty skimpy selection out there, and nothing I thought of good quality. And I was like, no, I don't really want to have the podcast with that on there. So basically it would have just been like a canvas cheap glove with a stamp on it, basically. So that's when I turned to the embroidery patches is the choice for now for the 200th.
I like that. That's a cool idea. So that's it I have for questions, but is there anything we didn't touch on that you'd like to add?
Yeah, I think just want to say a huge thank you to all past guests on the podcast. They're the ones who made this show, really. I'm the listener too. and I'm asking questions, but their knowledge, their passion, their experiences, that's really what makes this podcast work. And of course, a huge thank you to past interns who've helped with producing the podcast and editing those interviews with me. And of course, a thank you to all the listeners out there who have listened from episode 1 or whatever episode they joined in at. We love to have you, and we love to hear feedback from you.
Thank you so much for letting me do this Q&A with you.
Thanks, Josh. I hope people find it of interest. Egyptian starflower plant profile. Egyptian starflower, Pentas lanceolata, is a flowering plant that is actually a woody subshrub in its native habitat of East Africa and the Arabian Peninsula. It's hardy to USDA zones 10 to 11. In our mid-Atlantic region, it's used as an annual in containers and garden beds. The star-shaped flowers come in shades of purple, red, pink, and white. The foliage is lush and deep green. This annual does best in full to part sun. It's not picky about soil type or acidity levels. Pentas has season-long color, blooming all summer until it's hit by a frost in the fall. It can be grown from seed in late winter and even overwintered as a houseplant. Deadhead and fertilize it occasionally to encourage flowering. It's a valuable source of nectar for hummingbirds, butterflies, and other pollinators. Egyptian starflower, you can grow that. What's new in the garden this week? Well, my hydrangeas continue to put on their show. I'm loving the smooth hydrangeas, the mop heads, but this week I'm especially enchanted with the oak leaf hydrangeas. I have the dwarf ruby slippers that was introduced by the U.S. National Arboretum, and that one is putting on a beautiful flower display right now. And I'm also enjoying my smoke bush. It has that kind of ethereal looking flower or seed head on it right now, and it makes a great addition to any cut flower arrangement if you want to have some of that drama and that movement in there. I highly recommend cutting a few of those branches and enjoying those in your arrangements. Over at the community garden plot, we've harvested the garlic. It wasn't a big harvest this year, but I didn't plant that many, so wasn't that disappointed in it. Just a little bit to be able to add to some cooking and recipes this summer. The peppers and tomatoes are starting to show little baby fruits, and that's always exciting. The garden tips that we shared this week on our social media at WDC Gardener on Twitter or X, and on our Facebook page and to our Google group were all around the pollinator week. So this being pollinator week, we talked about the best plants to support pollinators, providing a water source for them, and providing a place for them to put their eggs and grow in your garden. We'll be going on break after this episode, marking our 200th anniversary, so check out some of our back episodes, and I hope you re-listen and share the show with others. In local gardening events that you might want to take note of, this summer, 2 of the Washington, D.C.'s public gardens are expanding or shifting their hours, and that includes the U.S. Botanical Garden on the National Mall. Will shift its conservatory hours from 11 a.m. to 6 p.m. from July 8th through August 30th. That allows them to replace the greenhouse glass roof in the conservatory garden court. So that's going to be an exciting project. Additionally, on July 18th and August 15th, the U.S. Botanical Garden will offer extended summer hours, staying open until 8 p.m. Similarly, the U.S. National Arboretum is going to stay open until 8 p.m. on the 4th Fridays of the month this summer. So that's June 28th, July 26th, and August 23rd. So you'll be able to enjoy those longer summer evenings at those public gardens. Happy gardening!
Get low-maintenance alternatives to lawns with Groundcover Revolution by Kathy Jentz. Reducing the lawn is among the biggest trends in homeownership, with an endless stream of homeowners looking for an eco-friendly alternative to a traditional turfgrass lawn. In the last few years alone, over 23 million Americans converted part of their lawn to a natural landscape, and now they're looking to do even more. The biggest challenge to adopting this new ideal of the perfect lawn? Knowing how and when to replace your turf and which plants are the best ones for the job. Groundcover Revolution is here with all the answers you need, and some you didn't even know you needed. Included are 40 in-depth profiles of plants that are perfect choices for replacing a grass lawn. There are options for sun, for shade, for dry and wet sites, and for various climates around the globe. There are choices that bloom, options that are evergreen, and selections that are deer-resistant. Kathy Jentz has also included an incredibly useful chart that gives you all the specifics on each of the 40 choices for quick reference and to make your ground cover selection process even easier. Whether you want to replace the entire lawn or just reduce the amount of land dedicated to turf, Groundcover Revolution will help you usher in a new and improved idea of what a beautiful lawn should be. Groundcover Revolution is available now wherever you buy books, including Amazon.com and Bookshop.org. In the book The Urban Garden by Kathy Jentz and Terry Spate, you'll find dozens of inspiring and creative ways to grow flowers, shrubs, vegetables, herbs, and other plants in small spaces and with a limited budget. Whether you want to grow on a balcony, rooftop, front stoop, or a tiny urban patio, turn your growing dreams into reality and build a gorgeous and unique garden that showcases your personal style while still being functional and productive. With the ingenious ideas and resourceful tactics found here, you'll be maximizing yields and beauty from every square inch of your space. No matter what you grow, the 101 amazing growing ideas found in the urban garden will turn your tiny urban yard into a treasure trove of green you'll be proud to share with family and friends. Buy your copy today at your local retail bookseller or order it online now at Amazon.com or Bookshop.org.
This is Christy Page with Food Gardening Network with the last word on 7 types of beans to grow to add color to your vegetable garden, an article by Amanda MacArthur. I'll admit that writing about the different types of beans to grow in your garden is no easy task. You could probably write an entire PhD thesis on beans if you were so inclined. There are hundreds of bean varieties, and within that, there are at least 6 types of bean plants. I won't get into the weeds here, bada bing, but I will say that aside from being one of the most nutrition-packed vegetables around, beans can have a striking appearance. Dried beans can come in a range of colors from deep black to speckled pink and white to dark red to almost any color of the rainbow. Of course, dried beans won't add color to your garden. Bean pods and flowers, on the other hand, will. So let's take a look at the different types of beans to grow in your garden, and I'll share a few varieties of each. Color everywhere, 7 types of beans to grow your garden into a Technicolor wonderland. I'll start with the 2 types of beans that grow in your garden, then we'll subdivide from there. Don't worry, this won't get too mathy. First is pole beans. Most of us are familiar with pole beans. These are the runner or vining beans that usually need a trellis or something they can climb. Kentucky Wonder pole beans are an excellent heirloom example here. They're known for their tenderness and flavor, and for color, they're often vibrant light green. The second is bush beans. As the name implies, bush beans tend to grow in small mounds, generally about 1 foot or 2 high. Purple Dove bush beans will give you a deep purple flower and amazingly rich purple pods. Or you can check out Royal Burgundy beans for something truly stunning. So now we have pole beans and bush beans as the overarching types of beans to grow, but they can also be divided into when you eat them. snap beans or string beans. These beans are your typical green beans. You eat the pods and all. One of the varieties to grow in this category is the gold mine. These beans are an almost fluorescent greenish gold. Dry beans. This is self-explanatory. Dry beans can come in bush or pole types. These range from good mother stallard beans to slippery silks beans. A Honduran heirloom with vivid red, purple, and green pods. Fava beans, or broad beans as they're sometimes called, are native to the Mediterranean region. Unlike many beans, they will tolerate some frost and prefer a long, cool growing season. Fava beans may not stand out for their color, but their unique shape and size make them eye-catching. Fava beans can withstand temperatures down to 15 degrees Fahrenheit. That's better than I can say for myself. Lima beans need warm temperatures and prefer basking in the sun when it's between 70 to 80 degrees Fahrenheit. Like favas, lima bean pods aren't incredibly colorful, but varieties like the Big Mama can have 8-inch long pods on 8 to 10-foot vines. And now wax beans. Wax beans are similar to green beans and are often bush beans. The most significant differences are in their appearances. Wax beans tend to be shades of yellow with waxy shells. However, some wax beans can be very colorful. For instance, the pod of the dragon's tongue bean is a creamy green color with brilliant purple mottling. There are still a few more types of beans that grow in a diverse garden, but as you can tell, the line between these different types gets a little confusing. Honestly, there are so many delicious beans out there that as long as you choose a type and variety that works in your climate, I am sure you can't go wrong. My advice, don't worry so much about what type of beans you grow. Just be sure that whatever you choose, you have the right space and soil to grow them. And most important of all, grow something you're excited to eat. This has been The Last Word by Christy Page at foodgardening.com.
Thank you for listening to GardenDC. You can become a listener supporter for as little as 99 cents a month by going to anchor.fm/GardenDC/support. Another way to support this podcast is to subscribe to our monthly digital publication, Washington Gardener Magazine. To do so, go to WashingtonGardener.com. Thank you. Thank you for listening to GardenDC. You can become a listener supporter for as little as 99 cents a month by going to podcasters.spotify.com/pod/show/GardenDC. Another way to support this podcast is to subscribe to our monthly digital publication, Washington Gardener Magazine. To do so, go to washingtongardener.blogspot.com. Thank you. You can find and follow Washington Gardener on Twitter /X, Instagram, and Pinterest at WDC Gardener, and on Facebook at Washington Gardener Magazine. Please take a moment to rate and review this podcast on Spotify and Apple. Open the Spotify or Apple app, search for GardenDC, check on the rate button, and select 5 stars.